So, Angela, we are going to welcome you. I don't want to slight much on your bio because I want you to make sure you have enough time to get through your slides. But I have known Angela, I don't know how long it's been, 15 years maybe now?
At least.
At least something. Angela, again, is known for her genealogical and historical research. She is the expert, in my mind, for the freedmen of the 5 civilized tribes, information, presentations, and training. She has done extensive work on the Civil War west of the Mississippi, Oklahoma Native Americans, benevolent societies, the 19th century women. She's got a book out called The Black Indian Genealogy Group, but also a recent book, volume 2, is The Freedmen of the Frontier. So there's 2 volumes to that. And so I want to welcome her today. Also to say that she was one of the founding members of Afrogenius, which there is a Facebook page to visit. We are co-instructors and coordinators for the Midwest African American Genealogy Institute. And we like to claim that we are the only genealogy institute focused specifically on African ancestry. They offer a 3-day genealogy institute every year in July, and you can go to maggieinstitute.org for more information. So Angela, I am going to stop sharing my screen and turn it over to you.
Oh,
and
wow.
Folks, just stay muted for the during the presentation, and we'll open up Q&A after that. And so we'll go from there.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Shelley. It is good to be here. Please let me know when you can see my screen. And then
I can see your screen. Thank you. And any Q&A, just put in the Q&A box.
Great. Well, I am excited. This is one of my favorite topics, looking at Black women who were very, very active during the Civil War period. You know, one of the things that sometimes we just come to think is that, you know, our folks are just sitting around waiting for the word that we're free. And of course, some of that began to change about 20 or more years ago when people started to speak about Black men who served in the Union Army. And so some of that narrative began to change a little bit. But still, what was missing? Well, what were the women doing? What were they doing? Waiting for the men to come home. We're free, my wife, my dear wife. Well, actually, we were busy as well. And I didn't really start out with this knowledge, but it's some information that has come to me certainly over the last 15 or so years in more detail, and finding out a little bit more about the role that women of African descent actually played during the Civil War. Many served apparently as nurses, as matrons, as laundresses, and as cooks. And what surprised me is that I found a paper trail. Now, one of the things, let's see here. Okay, I want to just share. Sorry, my screen was advancing too fast. We're talking about a group of over 20,000 women. Now, not 20,000 Black women, but 20,000 women have really been documenting as having provided some kind of service during the Civil War. But they also left behind records. And this really reflects the time that they spent. And some of them were tending to men who'd been wounded by battle, others who were ill with disease. They worked at campsites, they worked in hospitals, medical units, all kinds of things. A majority of those stories, however, are buried with the women, but some of them can be found. So what we're going to talk about in this session, we're going to look at least the background. How did this happen that women were doing anything during the Civil War? Where did they work? Who are the ones that we know about and the ones that we don't know about, which are probably a majority of our ancestors? And how do we document these women? Well, we have to look at what was the status of women in general. In the 19th century, we know that apart from enslaved women, obviously women who were not enslaved, there were few to no options for women to work outside of the home. But of course, we know it's well documented that women who were enslaved, they worked in the fields, they worked in the homes, they did whatever tasks that were required of them. And of course, some we know were besides those working alongside their husbands in the fields, many, of course, were documented as house servants or house slaves as well. And you see sometimes they're reflected in the numerous illustrations that often appeared in 19th century publications, and a few appear in early photography as well. So we certainly know a little bit about women in terms of their tasks. But come April of 1861, the war began. And war, any kind of war, but including the Civil War, it brought about all kinds of changes. War, any place that it occurs, can alter the trajectory of the lives of everyone, all across social classes. Obviously, this affected people who were enslaved, men, women, and children. The slaveholders and overseers, their lives were changed because they were no longer there to monitor the people they were holding in bondage because they had joined the Confederate Army. So the lives of males and females were dramatically changed. Most dramatically were the enslaved families. Restrictions against movement, they were gone. And understand, for many people enslaved, unless you had a pass, you certainly didn't walk off the property of the slaveholder, because severe punishments were certainly going to be in order if you were caught on the road or someplace where you were not expected to be without a pass, where someone is giving you permission to walk on the roads. And suddenly, enslaved people could take to the roads, and take to the roads they did. Also, of course, for men, dramatic change. They could enlist in the Union Army. Now, this did not happen at the beginning of the war, which we know was April 1861. And it would be 2 years before President Lincoln would finally authorize the formal enlistment of Black soldiers to join the Union Army, and gave permission to start recruiting soldiers. And recruit they did. Posters such as the one that you see began to appear all over the country, in the Northeast, but also in the Deep South. And you see different places as men were recruited, they were promised a bounty. Some places, such as those out of Camp Nelson, were promised $100 bounties. In other places, you see that other places of the South, you'll see that they were offered $300 bounties because they were joining the Union Army as volunteers. And their commitment was a 3-year commitment as well. But of course, the most promising thing was that they were now going to have that opportunity to be free. And so they were encouraged, come on, take up arms, to arms, to arms. Certainly this is our opportunity to fight for our own freedom. And that did happen. But one of the other things going on as the Union Army would go into a different community, the word had already reached from the South. If you study the story of contrabands, that was a title given to them as sort of seized property, and that came out of Fort Monroe, Virginia. But within 2 to 3 months, actually less than that, word had reached as far south as the Gulf of Mexico. Just get to the Union line and you will be free. And people did. They would get to the Union lines and show up. And so these contraband camps emerged, and entire families found refuge at these Union encampments. And for the first time, women of color began to now work outside of the confines of either the plantation or the farm or the household where they were enslaved. And they began to work on a large scale. And for the first time, they could now work for pay. Many of them took on jobs as cooks, some as laundresses, and others as nurses. Most of them came to these camps or these encampments, and they were known as contraband workers, but nevertheless, they were hired. And this was a dramatic change in their lives. So let's look at nurses. Now, before we go into the detail of who they were, we have to look at nursing as a profession, it was really still, we're talking mid 1800s, 1860s. Nursing as a profession was in its infancy and it was dominated by men. Also, understand that social protocol was not going to certainly be welcoming of the idea of women going into a dangerous situation, such as a field hospital, which was close to the line where there was action going on, military action unfolding. And add one more thing, there were no formal nursing schools, not many places where people could be trained. There were probably limited in terms of training of nurses. You find in some areas, in some of the monasteries, some of the Catholic sisters, the nuns were trained, and they were among the few who were considered trained. So as it was, even in some of the early Civil War illustrations, as battles began to unfold, you see images, of course, of the doctors performing surgery, but you see those who are assisting the doctors are typically men. And one of the more famous men, a face that many people don't necessarily recognize, but he became a very famous man, not necessarily for his work as a nurse, but he became famous years later because he began, as he was tending to wounds of soldiers, he began to become very, very reflective of what was happening. And it was his service, some believe, as a nurse that led him to the profession for which he's really known, and that is the life of Walt Whitman. And many of you have heard of him if you have studied American literature. But in terms of what was happening, you had things that were happening in the field, and the idea of still women going out to the field. And some of these were not established hospitals. They weren't always buildings. They were just little brush arbor structures and tents and just places where people were needing attention immediately. And later, within a year or so, there were those structured hospitals that were built and that were established. But what brought the need for change was the war itself. More and more casualties began to arise, as well as people dying of disease. But there was more of a need to really serve those in need of care. So more and more nurses, and it was clear that we're going to have to hire some women as well, because keep in mind, any population of able-bodied men had been conscripted to certainly serve in the Union Army or Confederate Army, wherever they may have been. So it was clear that there was a need for people to provide care. By the end of the Civil War, hundreds and hundreds of women served as nurses and matrons, and others as service workers, cooking and doing laundry and what have you. Where did they work? Mostly at the hospitals. There were the portable hospitals. Hospitals could be quickly put together and quickly moved, certainly as the battlefront would move to a different location. But this is an image of a hospital in Virginia, City Point, Virginia. And this is an image where you can see a lot of times the care was just done outside right there. But then there were some other places if there was something happening going into a new area. And particularly, we know that there were abandoned lands or abandoned pieces of property that sometimes a barn was taken over. And in some cases, abandoned homes were converted into hospitals as well, especially if they were near a site where there had been a Civil War battle. But then there were those field hospitals, just makeshift tents quickly thrown together. And one of the things that people forget, not only do you have the tents, but people had to sleep. They had to sleep somewhere. So you'll find a place where maybe surgery was performed or certain care was given to those who were wounded. But don't forget, the workers also needed tents and needed places. They needed quarters as well. And sometimes those quarters were temporary, just like those hospitals were. Here's an image, however, sometimes buildings that had been abandoned. This is a hospital out of Charleston, South Carolina, Roper Hospital. And there are images that you do see that are captured in some of the Civil War early photography images that do exist. but you also see paintings and drawings such as Jarvis Military Hospital in Baltimore. And what's amazing is that so few of these hospitals as a structure exist anymore. But they were at least captured during their time. There was Harewood Hospital in Washington, D.C. Again, most of these places you can only maybe just find a military marker where it used to be. Some hospitals were not on the ground at all. Some of them were floating. The most, I won't say important, but one of the most famous structures was the USS Red Rover. As you can see, it says USN Hospital, United States Navy Hospital. This originally began as a Confederate ship. It was captured and later converted to a Civil War hospital that floated up and down the Mississippi River. And there were, of course, even at that hospital, there were women who were serving as nurses there. There were some hospitals that only served U.S. colored troops and contrabands, the Black people who had emancipated themselves, made it to the Union line, and were in these small communities that had formed. But look at the names of some of them. The Contraband Hospital in Norfolk, Virginia. I know many people who research North Carolina. New Bern. Did you know that there was a contraband smallpox hospital in New Bern, North Carolina? Portsmouth, Virginia had a contraband hospital. And of course, there were freedmen's hospitals in different parts of the South, in Arkansas, in Mississippi, in Tennessee. And it is important to understand, again, the social norms of the day. Who would be tending the wounds or the illnesses of Black men? But the social norms of the day would not have had many white women tending to these Black men. These were Black women who were tending to these men. So let's take a look at the nurses, but we're going to look at those who are known. And I guess for me, I'll say more importantly, the unknown, because many of us come from those unknown nurses. But thankfully, they left a paper trail. Now they're the ones we know. We all know, and I love Harriet Tubman. We all love Harriet, but we know what she did. And of course, look at this former portrait. Many have seen this picture of her. She was a nurse. She was a spy. She was a scout. And of course, her greater fame was that as an abolitionist, this woman of the Underground Railroad and the role that she played with that coming out of Dorchester County, Maryland. We also know of Susie King Taylor, a woman who actually left her memoirs in a book when she talked about her life in a Civil War camp. She traveled with the 33rd United States Colored Infantry because her husband was in the 33rd, and she signed up and served with him. But some general background. Again, we have to look at the history of nursing itself. We have to acknowledge the works of Dorothea Dix. She herself assembled a group of women volunteers who said, you know, we've got to be able to do something to help what is going on. So she assembled a group of women who marched on Washington and demanded that women be allowed to assist in the war effort and to give attention to wounded soldiers. Later, she was appointed as superintendent of nurses in the Union Army. So her voice as a leader was very, very important. And she also established sort of a strict requirement of all women in terms of uniforms and how to dress and some of the regulations that she certainly had developed. Many people would say, oh, they were kind of strict in terms of, you know, don't look too attractive and different things that she was really suggesting. We're here to do a job. We're here to serve what's happening. We must also acknowledge Clara Barton, American Red Cross founder. We have to acknowledge her. She was inspired by her own father, who felt that it was her duty to perform service and to help serve soldiers who'd been wounded. And of course, she was, you know, a woman from a higher social class. And with the help of the ladies' aid societies, they started preparing bandages and food and clothing to be distributed to various people. And in 1862, she got permission to actually go on the front lines. This is something a year earlier would have been unheard of. And 2 years later, she was appointed as a matron by General Benjamin Butler. Of course, General Butler was the one out of Fort Monroe that many people realize and recognize his name. But he realized and acknowledged how important this woman was in terms of allowing women to go forth and to really help more directly with those in need of medical care. But the religious orders have to also be mentioned. They responded with nursing. They also started training other sisters, Catholic sisters, to also work, even though society thought women were too frail to do any of this work. However, Jane Keating, who later became known as Sister Mary de Chantal, was eventually made an administrator of the Wheeling Hospital in the Civil War. And the Sisters of Charity were also, in fact, they had over 600 nurses that they had trained in terms of administering care to people who were wounded or ill. Keep in mind that many people died of disease and not necessarily from military action. But on both sides of the war, there was a need for medical care, and care was given. And the Sisters of Charity, these are the ones, who wear the nuns' habits that kind of, if you remember the Flying Nun, these are the Sisters of Charity who wore that kind of clothing. But this is a popular picture that one can find of them at Satterlee Hospital. Satterlee General Hospital was, this is an image from Philadelphia, where that hospital was. And it was the largest Union Army hospital that was certainly unfolding. Many people never realized, war itself is devastating on thousands of lives, including those who were injured, including those who succumbed to disease or, just had so many things that were happening. But as I said, we're talking about those who were known. Susie King Taylor, as I mentioned a little bit about her life, she was an enslaved woman from Georgia. But somehow she had become educated secretly, and sometimes this did happen. She married a soldier from the 33rd United States Colored Infantry, one of my favorite regiments, by the way. And she traveled with that regiment as a nurse, and then later as an educator herself. Her own memoirs, A Black Woman's Civil War Memoirs, which you can find, you get her publication, her writings off of Amazon, and really where she describes what was really going on. I've already mentioned Harriet Tubman, but a few people don't realize that when she was in Charleston, she really was heavily involved as a nurse, particularly in the Gullah Geechee community in the Charleston area, in addition to all the other things that she did. I love Harriet Tubman. Everybody knows Sojourner Truth. Ain't I a Woman? We know certainly that speech that she gave. But people don't realize she also worked at Freedman's Hospital in Washington, D.C. So again, these are things, some of the people we know, we didn't know necessarily about their nursing, but this is something that we do know. Lucy Hicks Nelson, a little less known, but still documented. Now, this woman served with a white regiment, and she, of course, ended up fleeing from enslavement. And later, a picture of her is actually seen when she appeared, I think it was 1898 or so, at a reunion. And her picture is there among some of the other soldiers. And let's see here, I think something's not okay. There, you can see her there. She was there at that reunion as well. But there are those who are not as well known. And that's why we're here. We really want to talk about that. First of all, where can they be found? Where did they serve? And what was their role? Well, we know that there were some, just like Nelson, who was with this regiment, white regiment in Indiana. There were some who served in other regiments. This is an image of nurses, cooks, and laundresses who worked for the 13th Massachusetts. That was not a Black regiment, but these are Black people who were hired and who worked for this particular regiment. Now, for me, came a personal surprise. Many of you know I research communities in the Western frontier, particularly those regiments and units that served west of the Mississippi, as some people call it, the Western Theater of the Civil War. I began to document the soldiers out of the 57th United States Colored Infantry. I became interested how many of them filed for pensions, particularly because we know pension records are where you find some amazing stories. So I was just literally going through, making a list of soldiers from the 57th. I pulled the reel of microfilm that's done by regiment, and I pulled up the one reflecting soldiers of the 57th. Right in the middle of the reel of microfilm, I found an index card reflecting a man whose name was Benjamin Moore. And at the bottom, you can see, and I've kind of put it there in the foreground, the wife of the soldier's name was Benjamin Moore, has applied as nurse. So she was applying for her own pension as a nurse. Now, notice something significant, and I want you to remember, where it says U.S. volunteers, and then it has some numbers that follow that. U.S. volunteers is how the nurses are categorized and how they were categorized in military records. Because read it again, the wife of the soldier has applied as a nurse, not as a widow. Later, she applied as a widow, but she also applied as a nurse, as a Civil War nurse. So I became very, very interested in Benjamin Moore's wife's case. And as you see, of course, let's see here. You see those numbers at the bottom, 152560. Here it is, 152560. And this is Clara, Benjamin's wife. And she was living now at this time in Indiana, in Evansville, Indiana. Said she enlisted in March of 1864, and she was discharged October of 1866. Keep in mind that U.S. colored troops had a commitment to serve for 3 years. So she enlisted, so she did not just leave as soon as the war was over. She was still committed to perform her service until they were mustered out, because she traveled with a unit of U.S. colored troops. So from that pension file come statements that she was making about her own situation. And she was employed, she mentions the doctor, T.R. Dice, medical doctor, surgeon of the 57th Regiment, U.S. Colored Infantry, about January 1834 at Duval's Bluff, Arkansas. I served as a nurse, and I watched for this regimental hospital until the middle of May 1864, then moved to Little Rock and continued to nurse for the regimental hospital until about September 1864. About this time, I was transferred to General Hospital in Little Rock, Arkansas, and continued duty in General Hospital until about the middle of April 1865. And of course, after I read her pension, and there were other pages in the pension, I had to ask the question, can I find more records like this? Because what I did learn as I was going through the soldier's pension file, her file was embedded in his file, but that's because they were married. And as it said on that index card, she also applied, and there was her file embedded in his file. But my other question was, can I find other pensions? How, where, what? Well, I learned something else. I went to speak to the archivist, military archivist, and he said, oh, well, do you want to look at Record Group 94? I'm like, well, I don't know. What's in Record Group 94? Well, this was a surprise for me. There are service records. Now, many of you have researched service records, the ones that you find on fold 3, and you click on the regiment and you see these little, vertical cards, basically, muster rolls, really sort of giving you details, when they enlisted, how many times they were paid, when they were discharged, and what have you. Well, guess what? There are service records of Civil War nurses, Record Group 94. Make a note of that. I requested some records. First of all, I was shocked because I found 17 boxes of service records of nurses. And as you can see, this is the label, and I just zoomed in. This is the box they brought, one of 17 boxes. And I just pulled out beginning with the letter A, as you see, Aaron to Anthony, the names, whatever they were. Carded service records of hospital attendants, matrons, and nurses, 1861 to 1865. And what I found in there were they muster rolls, but these are service records, just like the service records you find in Civil War, for Civil War soldiers. But as you see, there's Rachel Axe there. I guess that's how you pronounce her name. Colored matron, and it gives you information. How was she employed? And of course, I just went down the line in terms of just in alpha order. And whenever I saw, in her case, of course, if it was a woman of color, it would say so. Sometimes you would find it on one of the pages, but you wouldn't find it on all of the other pages. For example, look at Anna Adams to the right. You see she's there at the Freedman Hospital in Memphis, Tennessee. Now, it just, you don't see colored necessarily there, but look at the card to the right. Certainly a woman of color who worked, and you see she was first in Memphis, but later you see her in Davis Bend, Mississippi. She traveled with the soldiers, and this is a woman of color traveling with a Black regiment as well. And so you do see sometimes information showing up about these women, and you can follow their movements wherever they were. And you'll see, I want you to pay attention to something now. Notice on those cards, these are pre-printed cards. And then of course, things were just written in by hand after that. So Balfour Hospital over to the left with Rachel at Portsmouth, Virginia. All the women who were at that hospital, their names are going to be found on that, but they're not sorted by hospital name. They're in alpha order. And of course, you see Freedman Hospital, Memphis, Tennessee. And then, of course, you see later a hospital for the same person, Anna Adams. Later, when they had moved, she's now at Davis Bend at a Freedman's USA hospital too, as well. But what's most important from all of this, the service records of these volunteers exist. And this is so exciting to know. Now, one of the things that you'll find almost every place where there was a Civil War battle unfolding, there were volunteers that were needed, volunteers from the civilian population. And so learn your local history. If you go to the website mappingthefreedmensbureau.com, one of the maps is showing you where USCTs fought in battles. Where there were battles, there were wounded soldiers. And where there was an encampment, there were some who were ill because of disease. But where there were hospitals, there were hospital workers as well. And chances are some of your ancestors could have served at some of them. Now, it is important to also pay attention to the history. If you have an ancestor who was in the U.S. Colored Infantry, pay attention to the history of that regiment and to see, well, wait a minute, what's going on here? They just weren't fighting battles and then moving on to another place and fighting a battle. Where there was a battle, there were wounded individuals who needed attention. And in addition, as you saw with the list of hospitals a moment ago, there were some hospitals that only treated illness. This is public health history, where such as the Contraband Hospital of New Bern, North Carolina. Well, I also found occasionally, just like Susie King Taylor, just like Clara Moore, who traveled with the 57, I found a service record on Fold 3 with the 11th U.S. Colored Infantry, a service record that somehow got mixed up in there of Melinda Sanders, who was a local citizen out of Fort Smith, who served as a hospital matron as well. Now, how do you find some of these records? I've already mentioned Record Group 94, all those boxes of records. And the last time I had actually looked at that collection, they had not been digitized, had not been microfilmed. Well, no, they hadn't been microfilmed. They're just free records. But I did learn, I guess it was earlier this year when I had a chance to go to the National Archives. Supposedly, these records that you've seen, these boxes, the 17 boxes, were supposedly pulled and taken to Archives 2 in College Park, hopefully to become digitized. So let's hope that that has happened. Most importantly, when you're at the National Archives, speak to the archivists and find whatever finding aids exist, because they have some real gems that are there. You can find some unique ledgers and other types of records. And you can sometimes find things that are as extensive or that appear to be extensive that are similar to the regimental records. I went to speak to the archivist and he shared with me some things. And look at the very bottom. You see where it says colored contract nurses? So I asked, what is that? Oh, the contract nurses, you want to see them? Yes, I do want to see them. So I had them brought, I ordered, and what was brought to me, probably about an inch, maybe an inch and a half thick, a ledger of colored contract nurses from 1863 to 64. So it was just a short time. We're just talking about a year, but it's a ledger that was kept reflecting mostly Virginia and North Carolina. And it's still fascinating to see. And this, of course, is the front of the ledger. This is the label that was on the side of the box. This is the way the front of the ledger actually appears. And even though it was, like I said, about an inch, inch and a half thick, the names of the nurses and the hospitals where they worked were there. Now, the hospitals that were reflected in that ledger were the Convalescent Hospital in Patterson Park, Baltimore, Contraband Hospital in Norfolk, Virginia, the Smallpox Hospital, Contraband, that I mentioned out of New Bern, North Carolina, Chesapeake Hospital in Chesapeake, Virginia, and another Contraband Hospital in Portsmouth, Virginia. How many of you are even aware that these places existed? And here it is right there, just on an old ledger on the shelf at the National Archives. There were additional hospitals in the ledger: Jarvis Hospital in Baltimore, Green Heights Hospital. I don't know where Green Heights was, it didn't say. McKim's Mansion, also in Baltimore. And so I did a little bit of just Googling and did a Google search and found that there were a few other contraband or hospitals, at least, that served civilians as well. And even in Old Town, Virginia, where people needed assistance. And look at Louverture Hospital. This is named after Toussaint Louverture. We've all read about him in terms of the Haitian Revolution. There was a hospital named after this man in Alexandria, Virginia. And there's no image of it, but this is probably one of the first hospitals that served people of African descent. That was a military hospital. But again, there were other places that also served a hospital that served people. Patterson Park, I mentioned that, in Baltimore, Maryland. But also on these pages, these are the names. I don't know if you can see my mouse moving. The names of the people who served, who worked at those hospitals. And it's important to pay attention. Here's Jarvis Hospital in Baltimore, and the names of the people who worked there. And you find page after page of people who worked there. Here's one, I transcribed the names, and you see these individuals: Eliza Francis, M.A. Johnson, Anna Richardson, and so forth. The names of these individuals. Contraband Hospital, and you see the names. You see a few men, but now at this point, this is 1864, going into 65, you start to see now women as well. Their names are now appearing. Another Contraband Hospital, and the names just go on and on and on. Louverture Hospital, this is serving certainly U.S. colored troops. And again, you see them. And it closed in October 65. The war ended in April of 65. And later they sent them to another military hospital after they closed Louverture Hospital as well. One of the things that's interesting, all the thing that exists of Louverture is a historical marker. And there's no picture of what Louverture Hospital looked like. There's the historical marker that you can see downtown in Alexandria. Contraband smallpox. Again, I mentioned it. It's a huge ledger of the people who worked there. Some of your ancestors, if this is the community that your family's from, maybe some of your ancestors could have worked there. The names of the nurses continue. It's a very extensive list. And they started really getting attention when someone from North Carolina wrote to the commander of the Department of Virginia, North Carolina, to the surgeon-in-chief of contrabands, which, look at all these divisions of the military. Many people didn't even know existed. But this person was writing, John Williams was writing, saying, you know, the colored people in New Bern, they need help. When they're taking a smallpox, they're just dragged across the river and they don't even have medical attention. And if they died, they just dug a hole and put them in without a coffin. And, you know, this is horrible. This is terrible treatment. So he was requesting assistance. And as a result, the Contraband Smallpox Hospital was established. Now, looking at the nurses themselves and the workers, because I certainly don't want to eliminate the other workers who were not hired to provide military, rather medical assistance. A lot of the working requirements were blurred because you had the matrons and the nurses. The nurses, of course, were there to provide medical assistance. Matrons were the supervisors of the nurses, but they often did the same thing. The laundresses and the cooks, they were really there to just do what was required. But the lines were blurred because oftentimes they all served in different positions. Now, one of the things that you occasionally find, as I said, those compiled service records, that sometimes you will find them. And of course, we're talking as we look at some of the organizations that were formed during the Civil War, especially if you're looking at U.S. colored troops, that was 1863 to the end of the war, up until 1866. But sometimes you do find some of their records are mixed up. Don't forget, many of them, because they served the military, they also got military headstones. And you find things such as Adeline Williams was a nurse. Her headstone reflects that. Of course, you see what appeared when she died. Auntie Williams died Saturday at her home in a little shack at the rear of 1728 South 14th Street. And she was buried Sunday afternoon. Now, this is from the Nebraska State Journal in 1897 when she died. She was well known as an Army nurse during the Civil War. Now, I mentioned the kinds of work that they did. A lot of their work was mostly domestic. And nursing, remember, as a profession, was really very limited. So they prepared, they served meals, they distributed linens, and, you know, if necessary, they would assist doctors in terms of treatments being administered to the soldiers. And sometimes they simply comforted soldiers. They read for them and wrote letters on their behalf. But there were distinctions in social class, even though the tasks were sometimes blurred. Women who were called nurses were often more literate than others. Well, those who were extremely literate and could also write as well as read, they were often the matrons. But it's very, very interesting because the little bit that we know about the experience of the nurses came from the memoirs and diaries or letters that they left behind. And it's said that women of color made up about 11% of the relief workers, although most were not always referred to as nurses. But this is still very, very interesting to note. And I mentioned the blurred lines of their tasks. Again, they had to do a lot of things in terms of supplies and domestic tasks as well. Matrons oftentimes worked alongside the nurses, and some of the nurses worked alongside the cooks and the laundresses as well. But the pension process. Now, remember when I discovered this, when I was just looking at the 57th U.S. Colored Infantry, how many got pensions? Because I was only looking for men. And then I noticed a woman who got her own pension as a nurse. Well, the process was difficult. If you've read Civil War pension files, those widows' pensions, it was extremely difficult for the women to even prove, especially enslaved women who had been certainly with their husbands for many years, but they had no proof of that. They had no marriage certificates. They weren't allowed to have official marriages registered anyway, any kind of place. So for them, even proving that they were connected to their husbands was a very, very, very difficult task. And for those who were involved with the relief effort, it was also difficult. So I mentioned, for example, seeing Benjamin Moore and later finding his wife, Clara, and finding
Hello.
that she also applied.
Yes.
Pardon? I think I,
Oh, Mr. McCarroll.
hello? I think I'm
I'm
hearing
fine.
someone.
How are
Yeah, I'm
you?
trying to mute her. I'm sorry. Let me
Good.
get to her. She
Okay.
doesn't realize she's
Yes,
not
yes,
muted.
yes, yes.
Okay. I'll wait.
Mary. Her name is Mary.
I'll wait.
Hold on 1 second.
Well, I know if you
Oh.
tried to call him, you.
Okay. There we are.
There it is. I
Okay.
see her now.
Okay, thank you. So, as I mentioned with the case of Benjamin Moore and his wife Clara, and of course, I learned that there were other women who also filed for pensions. And there's a whole collection at the National Archives that are microfilmed of women who were pensioners or nurses and civilian workers who were pensioners as well. But this was a surprise. And I just got this about a week and a half ago. In the middle of my weekly chat that I have with some of my Oklahoma researchers, someone said, you know what? I think my great grandmother Dorcas was a Civil War nurse. Now take a look at this. As you see, remember I said when I showed you Clara, underneath her name, at the top image, you see US volunteers, and then you see some letters, and then you see a number, and 1152560. You see that at the bottom, image 2, 1152560. Well, what do you see on this one? Dorcas Buffington. Now, if you research Indian Territory, Cherokee Nation, Buffington is definitely a name for the Cherokee Nation. She was a nurse in the medical department of U.S. Volunteers. Remember, Clara, U.S. Volunteers. That was what she was part of. Here is Dorcas in Indian Territory. What a surprise. This is a woman from the Cherokee Nation, a Cherokee freed woman she applied for and received her own pension. So I was thrilled as the person who researches Indian Territory and the 5 tribes to see a Cherokee freed woman there receiving her pension as well. So I also mentioned something about the USS Red Rover, the floating hospital. Well, there were at least 5 women of color who worked on that hospital as well. Now, the Sisters of the Holy Cross worked there. That's widely known. But there are 5 women of color, Black nurses on the staff of the USS Red Rover. Ellen Campbell, Alice Kennedy, Sarah Keno, Betsy Young, and Anne Bradford Stokes. These women also served on the USS Red Rover. I took a look and learned about Anne Bradford Stokes and found out some more about her. I'm going to share that in a second. Unfortunately, there are not a whole lot of images of the workers, but here's a couple of images that one can find. There is an image from the National Museum of Civil War Medicine and some workers out of City Point, Virginia. Names are not identified, but here's some of the images. And of course, we see a woman of color there. And contrabands who were working with the 13th Massachusetts. This was a white regiment, but there were people of color working as civilians, working as well. There's some other images of workers. Many have seen this image out of Nashville, Tennessee, and it's an image of people. Many people think are just freedmen, just living somewhere in Nashville. This was a housing unit on the left of individuals who were actually workers at one of the hospitals in Nashville, one of the freedmen hospitals. On the right, many have heard of Charlotte Thornton, educator, nurse. She was a nurse to the 54th Massachusetts. Those are the soldiers in the movie Glory. She was a nurse, and she was an educated woman, free woman of color. She also left an extensive diary, and she talked about some of her experiences when she was a nurse. There's a wonderful exhibit. I don't know if it's still traveling. It was out of Washington, D.C., called Binding Wounds, Pushing Boundaries, African Americans in Civil War Medicine. And these are a few pages that you see in the background from her journal that she wrote in 1863. And she talked about a soldier who had taken a ball in his stomach, and oh, how he's just in so much pain, and how horrible it was to see this man suffering so much. And she was able to write a letter to his mother on his behalf. And at the bottom, you see, she was surprised to learn that this man actually recovered and lived long enough to recover. But she was one of the few women of color who left her own accounts as a nurse. There's Rhoda Ray from Springfield, Missouri. She was an enslaved woman in Missouri, and during the Battle of Wilson's Creek, she and her family, as the word had gotten throughout the South or throughout the slaveholding states, get to the Union line. Well, she and her family got to the Union line, and she had learned that they had taken over that particular area, and their family home, or the home of the slaveholder, was now turned into the hospital. Well, she returned to that home and began to tend to wounded soldiers after that battle. She remained in Springfield and died there later, but her history as a nurse has been captured. Now, I mentioned Anne Bradford Stokes of the USS Red Rover. She was from Rutherford County, Tennessee. She was hired, or officially hired and paid, because this is the title given to people when they came aboard the ship, as a first-class boy. Yes, first-class boy, but that was her title. That was her pay level. She lived in Mound City, Illinois. She worked on the boat alongside other nurses there. She lived afterwards in Illinois, and she filed for her own pension, but she was rejected. But she fought that denial and applied again, and she was later awarded her own pension as well. But there's need for a lot more research, a lot more. A lot of those names are found in Record Group 94. Pull those records, document them. I mentioned those service records, 12, 13, 14 boxes need to be studied, and they do need to be scanned. And the hundreds of names, they need to be matched against those who filed for pensions. So much more really research is needed. Now, a current project will be made to document the hospitals and to really go into detail. And hopefully, as Mapping the Freedmen's Bureau website, as we have a chance, I'm hoping in the next year to add more features to that map, we will be able to add a little bit more, including information on the civilians. But this is exciting. And I have to thank Nika Smith, many of you know her. She shared this with me, months ago, about this new resource. And this is digitized on the National Archives. Look at it. List of female nurses, cooks, and laundresses employed in Army hospitals during the Civil War. This ledger is digitized. You can see it for free. No subscription is needed. And it's right on the National Archives website. And this is exciting. And when you get there, you will find this. And you just need to do a Google search. National Archives, nurses, cooks, laundresses, Civil War. And you'll immediately get to the page. And what you're going to get is this ledger. And as you can see, the bottom, each page is there. Now the ledger is not huge. There are only 41 pages in this particular ledger, but the names of the workers. These are females that it's specifically identifying who they are. And this is looking inside the ledger. And it's really kind of strange the way it's organized, because it's an alpha by location, and which is kind of strange to see that. So you see Albany, New York, Alexandria, Virginia, and it's not even a pure alpha listing, because you'll find some whole hospitals in Alexandria on a whole nother page, because then you'll see it by the name of the hospital. So it's a strange arrangement. Go through every page, just look at every single page. But you'll see Algiers, Louisiana, appearing right under Alexandria, Virginia, and Annapolis, Maryland, and so on. But then when you get to a city, here's Baltimore, you see Camden, okay, Camden Street General Hospital, or GH, but then you see Hicks Hospital, and you see lots of names. And as we zoom out and get to another page, you see a lot more. Again, there's that strange alphabetization. I hope I said that right. One from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, Beaufort, North Carolina, Beaufort, South Carolina. Look at Benton Barracks, Missouri. Look at all of those people across the river, Cairo, well, into Illinois. And of course, you see others. Camp Burton, South Carolina. You'd be surprised how many different hospitals there were. And they go on and on. Now, this one was really impressive. Corps d'Afrique Hospital. Now, if you know anything about regiments, United States Colored Troops out of Louisiana, they originally began as Corps d'Afrique, meaning the African Corps. There was a Corps d'Afrique hospital, and the list of women who worked in the hospital in some capacity is huge. Now, if this hospital is serving mostly Black patients, you can be assured that a majority of those workers were women of color as well. But look, this is still Corps d'Afrique Hospital. It's at least 2.5 pages of names. And again, this is another resource for you. Another resource for you to really tell the story. Even if your own relatives are not there, if you research your community, you might recognize the names of others whom your family probably knew. And it's still part of that community's history. It just goes on and on. Very, very impressive. Now, this National Archives ledger, as I said, it is there. And I meant to put the locator web address, but that's okay. If you just do a Google search, National Archives, female nurses, cooks, and laundresses, Civil War, bam, it'll pop up. And it is free. You do not need to subscribe. To summarize everything, we have one charge. Let's go find those untold stories, these stories of these amazing women. And of course, you know, we acknowledge the history in terms of who these women were and the many things that they did. And of course, we appreciate the work of those who we know, but especially those who we don't know, because many of us come from those whose names we don't know. So go find their stories. Read Susie King Taylor's story. She goes into detail, different things that she did. Find where those hospitals were located. Some were located right there on the battlefront, on the field, but others floated up and down the river. And even others were in large cities, in Baltimore, in Washington, in Philadelphia, wherever they may be. Let's expand this narrative of African American women in the Civil War. We stand upon their shoulders. We have a lot of work to do, but this is such an important task that we have. Thank you all for listening. I'll be happy to answer any questions that you may have. I will stop sharing and turn it back over to you, Shelley.
All right. Well, thank you. This was awesome. The details. I didn't realize there was a record group 94 and it addressed that. I had no, I know 105, you know.
Well, I'm glad you know that too. But
So anyway, and I'm sure, some of us will be hopping right over there and looking through there to see what's there that, building off of what you've shown us. But yes, there are some questions. And let me just go to the chat, and I can make anyone just raise your hand if you want to ask the question live. If not, I will read what I see in the box. Juliana said, were there records for the cooks, specific records just for cooks that you found?
Okay, not limited. They're embedded. Those boxes that I showed you where it had those service records, you'll see one colored cook, and some not necessarily color cook of any color. They're just mixed up in there. And I have at least never seen a list of cooks isolated by that task. Because again, some of those tasks, those were blurred lines in terms of what they had to do. Some nurses also had to cook occasionally too. So, but I've never seen a cooks only list.
Yeah, let me ask a follow-up. So in the regiments, because I know you do a lot of USCT research, in the regiments in the list, do they include the cooks and folks that are there in addition to the soldiers? I know we could get the drummers, the fifers, the soldiers, or whatever, but were the cooks mentioned, or the wagoners?
Generally, no.
Okay.
Because you'll see them listed by company A, company B,
Right.
company C, and those were people who had been trained to fight, or whatever their task was, to guard, an installation or a bridge or what have you. So no, they're generally not included. That one image I found of Melinda Sanders, she was like a stray piece of paper that ended up in a regimental paper of the U.S. Colored Infantry. But I've never found, she's the only one that I found. And I think it just got scooped up when they were moving, and hers ended up being embedded there. But no, generally no.
So this is definitely opportunity for more digging, just like
Oh,
the free
absolutely,
detail.
absolutely.
We haven't even made a dent. We meet every Friday and we haven't even made a dent.
Haven't made a dent. That's right.
No. Okay, your next question is, what is the best way to make sure you have found the best finding aid? Are there normally more than one finding aid for each source?
Absolutely. And if you're at the National Archives, I recommend that you go and talk to the archivist. And if you're at the National Archives, Archives 1, the one on Pennsylvania Avenue, once you've gone through the whole process of, getting into the building, then go to the right, you'll see some glass doors, not the Innovation Hub, but that's where you go to talk to the archivists and tell them what you're researching. I'm interested in the Civil War. I'm interested in civilians who perform service. Then they're going to know, then maybe you want to look over here. And they will have a book, and this is for any population or any collection that you're researching in the National Archives. They have something called a preliminary inventory, which is a list of everything that they have related to your topic. And that's when I was shown that list, and I saw when I put that little arrow at the bottom, colored contract nurses. And I'm thinking, what the heck is that? Yeah. And so, you want to see the colored nurses?
Right.
Yeah, of course. And they'll just fill out the little slip for you and pull them and send them to you upstairs to the reading room. So the best way to find out what is best, or what's there in general, you can make a decision what's best after you look at it. Just go and talk to the archivist, because they are the specialists who really know what their holdings are. So talk to the archivist.
And we'll give a shout out and a greeting to Melissa Barker in the chat, because she's here and she's one of those archivists in Tennessee.
Yes,
so
she is.
Archivist. Yes. Actually, she's got a good blog to follow as well. So she writes some great articles and things. So the next question is from Claudia Houston, and I'm going to read this to you.
Okay.
I just wanted to let you know that several years ago, you posted the ledger of workers at the New Bern Contraband Smallpox hospital on a blog.
Yes.
I am the historian for New Bern Historical Society and was so fascinated by this. I did a lot of research and wrote an article regarding this hospital. No one knew it even existed. We have since, we believe, found the location of the hospital. I tried to track some of the workers to find out where they went and what they did after the war, but it was almost impossible to discern. Thank you for this information because it opened up so much history for us. So I'm going to kudos to that. And thank you for sharing that, Claudia.
Thank you. And I would love to communicate with you a little bit more because I think that that's one of those I'll just say those emerging descendant projects that probably needs to be developed. Shelley Murphy, of course, is involved with the descendants of the enslaved workers at UVA. I'm involved with a project out of Oklahoma, descendants of the Tulsa Massacre. A lot of universities are involved with descendant project initiatives in terms of looking for enslaved workers. But I'd like to speak with you more, and I will put, I'm not sure if the chat is working. I will put, if possible, my email address in the chat because I'd love to communicate with you more about this. And thank you for seeing the blog, but also beginning the search to find that. I am so thrilled to hear that. Thank you. Thank you.
And I'm going to say this one very quietly because we know something is coming up. But Liz, who is a Maggie alum, posted a question. When is Angela going to teach a Civil War course at Maggie? Hint, hint. And we're going to move right along. But just know, Liz, something is coming. So just stay tuned. Just stay tuned. That's all I got to say. It's a great question. So anyway, the next question is from Sister Regina. This just filled my heart. Did you recognize any of the surnames from the Fort Smith, Arkansas area?
I didn't recognize the names. And this is what is so amazing to me, because it really helped me and humbled me to a great degree to see how much we don't know.
Yeah.
As much as I look at things from Fort Smith, look at what I don't know. Oh my goodness. And these are women who lived full lives. And I don't know them. They're probably the ancestors of people I grew up with, and they don't know them either. But it's something that just left me awestruck. Oh my God, look at all of these people who I don't know. So,
names. And you got location of where they're at.
Yes.
It's names. Beautiful. Danielle has a question. What states were the Corps d'Afrique that you showed located? Or
Louisiana.
All right.
Speaking Louisiana. The Corps d'Afrique is straight up Louisiana. And don't forget, Louisiana provided more regiments of U.S. colored troops than any other state in the Civil War. So
aren't they the ones that had the home guards?
They were originally at one point called the Louisiana Native Guards.
Native Guards, and then they became USCTs.
But originally, many of them had tried because they were free people of color. So they considered themselves Southerners. And they were going to fight for the South. Hey, we're Southern men. We'll fight. What's the Union Army's coming? And then they were told, no, this is white man's war. You all don't belong here.
Right.
And then they realized, whoa, we're fighting for the wrong side anyway. And many did become Union soldiers, in fact.
Leslie Anderson shared the chat, shared a link, deets for hospital at Alexandria Government Historical Sites, and it looks like it's the Overture Hospital.
Oh, really?
And so I don't know. Can you go to Q&A and see that one?
Okay, let me see.
Because if not, I'll share it.
Okay, this is Leslie. Oh, I see it.
And welcome, Leslie.
Yes. Oh, I've heard Leslie speak several times. Oh,
and
thank you. I've got that link. I'm going to say that.
Okay.
I'm going to just put it in. I'm just open up another tab for myself to look at it.
And Ramona LaRoche. Let me find her. She wants to ask a question, and I'm going to assume that that means live. So
Thank you so much. No, my chat is disabled and my question, I couldn't unmute. So whatever on your end, I couldn't do it. But thank you, Angela. So good to hear you again. It's been some time since we've seen each other.
Yes, thank you.
My question is related to Susie King Taylor. Having been a reenactor myself of her, I know that she began, her career with the soldiers as a teenager at 14, but I also remember that she was never paid. She never got any compensation for any of her work. So my question is, was it determined for women to get pensions based on their being single, or do we have a record of the time frame when pensions were beginning to get received by the women?
Right.
Do we have any kind of idea of how that
Well,
works?
my understanding is that pensions were being paid to soldiers as early as the 1870s. There may be some that are earlier than that. I have seen widows' pensions from the 1880s, but that's because their husbands had died and their husbands were deceased. But you're also making me think, and maybe you've already done this, because I have read and have her book, but I have never looked for her files. She probably has a thick file because rejected files are sometimes thicker than approved files. Have you pulled or tried to see if there's a paper file on her in terms of pensions at the National Archives?
I have not.
That might be an interesting thing to do. And actually, I have not looked, and maybe someone, if they happen to have the pension index open while we're still here, they could take a look and see if her pension application is there on the index. And I think it is something, I've never pulled it, maybe I should. And you're making me just think, okay, put that on my list to do the next time I get to the archives. But it might be something to do, to look and see for what reason, what was it that couldn't be proven? Certainly, she's very well documented, but what is it that's missing there? So
Right.
I'd like to see that myself. But thank you for asking that,
Thank you.
asking that question. And the fact that you are a reenactor for her, I like that as well. And that's definitely a task for you. As you reenact her life, you need to know all those details.
Yes.
So